In this section, we'll look at Franklin Roosevelt's successor, Harry Truman, and his record on African American civil rights up and through the 1948 election. With the civil rights movement showing signs of life during World War II, the death of Franklin Roosevelt kind of made everybody really uncertain. Vice President Harry Truman ascended to the Oval Office, and on the surface, he didn't appear promising to African Americans. He'd only been a president a matter of months, and he hailed from Missouri, hardly a progressive state on race relations. And with the Cold War commencing, Truman had many issues on his plate, and he had political reason not to court such a divisive issue as African American civil rights. Below the surface, however, Truman was a fortuitous turn for African Americans. His parents had taught him to be, quote, charitable, forgiving, and patient, unquote, part of a prayer he repeated throughout his life, while his service in World War I exposed him to a diverse array of humanity and attitudes. While Truman, as an aspiring politician early in his career, flirted with membership in the Ku Klux Klan, he ultimately didn't join, despite the power of that organization at its historical height. Indeed, as a judge, Truman showed tremendous courage in ruling against the KKK, which later, according to Truman, threatened to kill him. In fact, part of the reason FDR picked Truman as his 1944 re-election running mate was that he wanted a Southerner on the ticket, but one who hadn't been a really racial demagogue. As Truman settled in as president, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP, began to press for civil rights. The organization, already almost half a century old, recognized that the time was ripe for activism. Once again, as I said earlier, African Americans had a record of sacrifice in the war, and they had high expectations. The migration of African Americans to the northern cities made voter registration drive easier. It was important, the NAACP believed, to press the issue early to maintain the momentum they had begun during the war. The registration drive indeed had some success, as the percentage of African Americans registered grew. In the South, it grew from 2% in 1940 to 12% in 1947. Not surprisingly, the black activism produced a violent reaction. In 1946, whites killed several African American war veterans who had voted that year in rural Georgia. Angry whites flogged to death a, quote, uppity black tenant farmer in Mississippi and blowtorched a young black in Louisiana for daring to enter a white woman's house. Angry whites blinded a black soldier for failing to get in the rear of a bus in South Carolina. In Columbia, Tennessee, in 1946, whites rioted against African Americans who insisted on voting. Police arrested 70 blacks and looted and basically looked the other way as a white mob broke into the jail to murder their 2 black prisoners. This violence put Truman under a lot of pressure, as black activists picketed the White House with slogans reading, quote, "Act, Mr. President," unquote. Former First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt signed fundraising letters for the legal defense of African Americans, faced with bogus charges. In an early sign of the importance of the white evangelical and Catholic ministers to the modern civil rights movement, Eleanor helped form the National Committee for Justice, which included a number of both black and white religious leaders, and which urged reform. The problem Truman faced was the same one Roosevelt had faced. Truman wanted Congress to pass civil rights legislation, but that required enough votes to overcome a surefire Southern filibuster. Truman was a Democrat, but the party's historical strength lay in the states' rights South, which resisted all federal interventions. To press civil rights legislation would be to anger his own party and possibly endanger his other economic and foreign policy goals. So, feeling like he was unable to pass civil rights legislation, Truman appointed a commission known as the President's Committee on Civil Rights to investigate possible actions. In 1947, the commission, made up of distinguished Southerners, blacks, educators, and ministers, issued a famous report entitled To Secure These Rights. The report documented the abuses of Jim Crow and called for a series of reforms, including the abolition of the poll tax, the creation of a civil rights division within the Department of Justice, and the desegregation of all government offices and facilities. In doing so, the report in essence represented the first national call for an end to Jim Crow and segregation. In a special session of the Congress, Truman endorsed the committee's recommendations to lavish praise from black leaders. When Congress still didn't act, Truman decided to do what he could as president with executive actions. Undoubtedly, he wanted to win black votes to the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party, once again, had historically been the party of the Confederacy and states' rights, with the Republican Party the party of Lincoln. Accordingly, Truman appointed the first African American governor of a U.S. territory, William Hasty, who was appointed the governor of Virgin Islands. Truman later appointed Hasty as the first black federal appellate court judge. When Truman's allies in the party won a pro-civil rights plank in the Democratic National Convention, Truman began courting the African American vote for the 1948 election. He became the first president ever to address a civil rights organization when he addressed the NAACP at the NAACP convention in 1948. Most significantly, Truman issued Executive Order 9981. 9981 desegregated the military. At first, opponents claimed the order would weaken national defense, and indeed progress in implementing it was slow, especially in the Army and Marines. It was less a problem in the Navy, where blacks and whites had already shared the same ships. The Army was not completely desegregated until the Korean War, when the military discovered that African Americans fought more effectively in integrated units. Within years, the Army became a great opportunity for young black men lacking equal opportunity in civilian life. Some have claimed that integrating the military was actually one of Truman's greatest achievements. Truman's actions predictably really ticked off traditional states' rights Democrats in the South. Claiming that Truman had, quote, stabbed the South in the back, unquote, 35 delegates from Alabama and Mississippi walked out of the Democratic National Convention. Joining with other Southern segregationists, they formed the States' Rights Democratic Party, more popularly known as the Dixiecrat Party, promising to preserve the, quote, Southern way of life. The Dixiecrats nominated South Carolina Senator Strom Thurmond as their presidential candidate. The Dixiecrats were an important step towards future Republican conservatism in the South. Indeed, Thurmond later became a Republican himself. Of course, the departure of a good portion of the Democratic Party in the 1948 election didn't bode well for Truman's election chances. Truman's hopes appeared to fade further when left-wing Democrats also left the party to form the Progressive Party, and they were angry over Truman's staunch anti-communism and fearful of a war with the Soviet Union. Surprisingly, however, in a very famous shocker, Truman still won the 1948 election. The departure of both the far-right Dixiecrats and the far-left progressives arguably aiding Truman's reputation as a moderate. Thurmond won only 4 southern states from Truman, but it was not enough to deny Truman the election. This includes the section on Truman's civil rights efforts through the 1948 election.